Julie Wadsworth, content creator, event host, workshop facilitator, and creator, professional speaker, and a whole lot more. I just had a session with my therapist that ended about an hour ago, and by far the best therapist that I've worked with. It took five within the past 2 years to get to this point, which so I'm really invested and happy to be in the space. Right now, what we're doing is kind of timeline mapping the different events and structures that have happened within my life. And, I'm pretty good at telling these stories about myself. And, of course, it's bringing up details that I kind of forgotten or talk about less often or even think about less often. Now, I'm not feeling especially emotional. I've again talked about this stuff quite a bit. I've done quite a lot of processing, and the mapping is more or less just to figure out where in my life I'm still hanging on to stories that are impeding me from doing some of the things that I want to do. And upon reflecting on that there are still things in my life that stories I'm telling myself um, that may or may not have a lot of validity and truth in them, but the way that I am telling the story and what it means for me and who I am and what I'm worth and what I'm worthy of don't necessarily align with reality or align with the outcomes that I want. I just looked out the window. This is this is very picturesque, and thought about a compliment that someone had given me recently. And she essentially said something to the degree of, "You've got to be the smartest person I know." And a few things come to mind as I'm saying that even now. One, there was such a value placed on logical and cognitive and intelligence in my upbringing, so much so that there really was not a lot, if any, room for emotions. And we are emotional creatures first. We process information, our body acting as kind of an antenna. Um, and then it feeds up through the amygdala first, which is the emotional center or cortex of the brain, before it moves into the prefrontal cortex, which is where emotion and logic intersect. Now, what can happen a lot of times is that we try to route past the emotional, meaning we're feeling something. It can be anger or sadness, it can be whatever, grief. And we have to compartmentalize it in order to wade our way through our current situation. So we're kind of doing a bypass, but then we have incomplete logic in the prefrontal cortex and we get stuck in an emotional state. We just keep building and building and building these emotional experiences until we shut down or we struggle to connect or it's hard to get out of bed, right? We create a depression in ourselves. So as I'm looking out the window, I'm thinking about for a moment all of the things that I could have been. I think about a few people in my life and how they look at me and they value me and see a lot of potential. And I've not lived my potential. In fact, I've really blown it out of the water in a lot of contexts. But I also burn out because when I go at something, I go at something. And I got a little sad as I was looking out the window and thinking about all the things that I could have been, and which then struck me as funny. Like immediately, I was like, we're having a moment, and that's okay. We can have the moment, but let's be real. You're 35. You're in excellent health. You are doing all of the things that you know how to do at this point in time to take care of you, to live a long, happy, successful life. And who the fuck, who the fuck's stopping you? Who's stopping you from doing all of those things? Because you still got quite a few years left, most likely. And just go and do them. Like nothing is stopping you. Now, if you're afraid of the hard work, that's one thing. Let's pull that apart and ask the why. What if you are afraid of the climb? Why? Well, there's shame in the mix. There's exhaustion just thinking about how far that climb feels, which isn't necessarily true. It's just the feeling, it's the experience that I'm having internally. But also, I don't have to bite off the whole thing all at once, right? For example, if I wanted to go back and get a very specific degree, master's, then there's nothing stopping me. That's going to be a process. It's going to take a few years, but that's the point, right? You're climbing for it. It's a process through which you are telling yourself that you are capable. You're learning the skills, and then by the end of it, more often than not, anyway, you feel much better aligned to the outcome. Meaning, it's not just the master's degree, of course. It's how you use the master's degree, for example. So, wanted to share that moment with you because I'm sure I'm not alone in having a moment where I was like, look at all the things that I could have done. And I understand. I understand. Not everybody is where I'm at, meaning, right? Like, I got myself to a place where I have more room to take care of the things that I need to take care of and want to take care of. I also like reminding people of this part of my story, which is I grew up in poverty with a completely and totally disconnected mother who struggled enormously with mental health and body image and brought men around who were completely and totally unsafe. And there's a lot more to that story. I struggled with food scarcity as well. There's a lot more to that story. I went into foster care at 11 and was completely thrown from one environment into something completely and totally unfamiliar with a family that had just seen so many foster kids. And for some foster families, that means that they're really, really invested in their kids and they learn to love. And for some, they just become complacent. And I was in complacency. I was fortunate enough to have a friend of the family pick me out of foster care for a few months before I moved in with my biological father. And then he had a very specific proclivity for a certain type of woman, as I like to say, a lot like my biological mother. But the thing is, when he married this next wife, she wasn't my mother, which meant that my protections that I would have with a biological mother, or generally would have, weren't there. Went through a lot of abuse and neglect in that situation. Was dropped off at a youth homeless shelter when I was 15, lived with teachers, right? Lived in a domestic violence shelter when I was 8 months pregnant because I was almost killed. I made the newspaper and that event. My mother, I don't tell this part of the story very often, but my mother almost made the sex offender registry for some of her actions earlier in life, which was an incentive, a further incentive other than bouncing around a ton, for me to drop out of high school, because that was my last name attached to that stuff. And even though, I was her child and people didn't really know how I grew up or that I was separate from her, right? People make assumptions. Um, and then I had a daughter who died who was 4 months old when I was what I think 2023. Yeah, 23. And I've seen some shit, man. And even since then, like a lot of life has happened since 23, a lot of life. And I tell this story because it's important to note that I broke through the six figure, um, you know, bring take home pay uh threshold, I guess, if you will, coming from almost nothing. And I will continue to climb that because I'm willing to take the dare. But I still struggle at times with, I guess it's fear, is probably the most honest way to term it, right? It's, well, how can I maintain this life? And what's ironic about that is not only does it stop us from proceeding, and I mean, we can choose to proceed with fear. And in fact, that's really the only way to do a lot of things, but it also throws this extra weight on us. It's a because it sucks the life out of us and then it de-energizes us. And the energy could otherwise be used to channel and focus on the things that we want. So I don't think shame and fear are criminals. I don't treat them like they need to be outcast, ostracized. I don't shame my shame, essentially. the goal is to validate the fear and the shame, right? It's, I see where you're coming from. You're looking to protect me because we know this area, we know this arena, we know that we can survive in it and that we can be okay. And so thank you for looking to take care of me. And then it's, I can even feel it in my chest right now, just even as I'm rehearsing, it releases some of the tension and the weight. The validation of our own experiences, treating these emotions almost like they're individual human beings living in us, um, does a lot. So the only thing, and I listen, I mean the only thing, and I know I could be speaking to people who are in extreme poverty, loaded up with children, developing, maybe in a developing nation with, I won't say fewer resources because the resources are different. They're more diverse. But I will say that the resources may not be as readily available that I have in front of you. So I say this believing that you can go and go to the places that you want to go, meet the people you want to meet. Because if you're able to see this, you have access to the internet, right? And there are countless pathways for somebody who's willing to get really curious, invested, and break out whichever realm of creativity you own and are able to harness. When I ask myself about all of the things that I could have been, I'm choosing to reframe that to all of the things that I already am and will be. Thanks for watching.